Welcome to the Alain Elkann interviews, an unprecedented window into the minds of some of the most well-known and respected figures of the last 25 years.
We are with Jennifer Clement today. This is the author of many books, as we know, but she just published a new book called The Promised Party, and the subtitle is Carlo, Basquiat and Me by Jennifer Clement. The publisher is Canon Gate. This is an interesting book. Can we say that in a way it's a kind of an autobiography, right?
Yes, we can definitely say that. Yeah.
And this autobiography is divided into very important periods of your life. In the first 20 years, 18 years in Mexico, and then in New York and Paris, the second part of the book. I mean, it goes up to your youth, your university years and so on and so forth. If I understood well, your parents were American, your father Jewish, your mother from Nebraska, and they decide to move to Mexico City when you are young, you're a child, a little child.
A baby, 6 months, yeah.
So at home, your language was English, and then you went to English school, but obviously Spanish is your other language. Was it a happy childhood and adolescence, yours, in Mexico?
It was complicated. I mean, one of the reasons that I chose to write this book was because even though I didn't live through that golden age of Mexico, in a way, I'm covered with the gold dust. So I knew all those people as a child and growing up. So happy, I mean, I had very complex parents. I mean, pretty wonderful parents in many ways, but also complex parents. So the childhood, the sort of happy, amazing side of the childhood was that I was raised by a nanny, Chona, who was completely illiterate. So I became her alphabet. She couldn't read or write. And so I also see the book as the portrait of an artist as a young woman. So what were the things that sort of helped to make me? And I'm sure that one was this sort of mother figure, more than a mother figure. I became her alphabet and her reader and all of that. I mean, I think it was happy and unhappy, as are many childhoods. It was sort of a mix of both.
When you talk about this nanny of yours, this illiterate nanny, the counterpoint is a sophisticated woman, Aline Davidoff-Mizrahi, who is your friend, lifelong friend, right? Very different from you, small woman, very elegant, some young child, even she was in school with you, very sophisticated, and Aline becomes a lifelong friend.
Yes. So Aline, she came from an extraordinary family. Her grandfather was Alberto Mizrahi, who was a Sephardic Jew. And he was really the discoverer of Frida and Diego. And it was Frida's grandmother.
You mean Frida Kahlo and Diego.
Frida Kahlo and Diego Rivera, yeah.
Yes.
And Aline's grandmother took Frida to the ABC hospital for all her operations. And they were very much the caretakers of Diego Rivera and Frida Kahlo. And so it was always amazing to be at Aline's house because of everybody who was there and the kind of parties that occurred, and all the sort of intellectuals and painters were always over at the Davidoff's house. And so it was always sort of a magical place.
At the same time, you lived in Mexico City, very close to, that's maybe a coincidence, very close to the Frida Kahlo house and Diego's house. And with one of Diego's granddaughters, you used to go into Frida's house.
Yes.
Not only that, but also to stay in her bathtub where she used to stay. I mean, can you tell me a little bit of this?
So one of Frida Kahlo's most famous paintings is called What the Water Gave Me. And she's in the bathtub, and it's a portrait, actually, in the bathtub. And everything that floats in the water is a portrait of her life. And so It was just this incredible chance that of all the streets in Mexico City, my parents decided to live on that street. That house, now it's a museum. And that street, when I was growing up, was called Calle Palmas. Now it's called Calle Diego Rivera. And that house is now a museum. But when I was growing up, first of all, Frida was nobody. I mean, this Frida madness is, relatively new in the last 20 years or 25 years. But growing up, she was Diego Rivera's wife. She didn't really have the place that she has now. And it was a house. And so my great friend, who I grew up with, my first important friend, because I think the book is also a book about friendship. And so that first friend was Diego Rivera's granddaughter. And so that house was my second home. That's where I spent a lot of my time, in that house.
You forgot to say that maybe that in the shadow of this youth, the Davidovs knew also Trotsky, right? Who has been, the famous Trotsky, but in the same time, I think he had an affair with Frida or something
That's
like
correct. That. Yes, he did. So yeah, there was all, a group of intellectuals.
The grandmother Davidov was going around Mexico City with a white Jaguar and Trotsky.
Yeah, it's right. And Trotsky and the white Jaguar, an incredible thought, but that's how it was. There's quite a few stories in the book that are not actually my stories. But one of the things that's so amazing about writing, that you realize that you can tell other people's stories that won't get told unless you write them. So there's, for example, Davidov's stories, the story about Elena Garro, Octavio Paz's wife, who is one of the great writers of the 20th century in Mexico. And there are two stories in there, for example, when she gets in a fight and she calls the funeral home and she sends them their coffins and great crowns of flowers. And those are not exactly my stories, but they're stories of the time, and they're stories that would be forgotten if I didn't tell them. So I have, for example, Elena Poniatowska's story that she told me of when she met Mercader, the killer of Trotsky, in jail. And she just, without thinking, shook his hand, the hand that killed Trotsky, and how forever after, her hand is a hand that feels sort of stained in a way. So there are these stories that aren't exactly my stories.
Later in the book, where we will encounter, we'll talk about this later, but when you are with another friend, which is Suzanne, you meet through Suzanne and Basquiat, you meet Burroughs, who also was in jail in Mexico City, next to Mercader, right? I mean, they were in the same time in jail.
Yes,
but then we will talk about this later. You have an amazing life because you were in school, if I'm not wrong, with the children of Garcia Marquez also, right?
That's correct.
So literature, I mean, at least writers are in your life since the very beginning. And you were writing poems as a small child. That's what you say in the book, right?
Yeah.
You were already writing poetry as a very young child.
Yes, exactly, as a very young child. And in fact, one of the things that I had to think about a lot about this book was the form. Like, how would I write it? Thinking that a lot of memoirs today are serving a kind of a market that sort of asks that a memoir read kind of like a novel. And I really didn't want to do that. I mean, I thought of Pasternak's sort of memoir where he says it's not an autobiography, it's not a biography, because that is the book for a hero. And I'm a poet, so I tried to think, how would the book be? This thing of the memoir being the novel is a new thing in a way. If you read Nabokov's memoirs or even Octavio Paz's memoir, which is in verse. So I ended up taking a line from T.S. Eliot, who said that life is a fragmentary whole because memory is a fragmentary experience. So I tried to write it thinking of that idea as the fragmentary whole.
And the book is fragmentary in the sense that it's written in very short chapters.
Exactly.
So each one of these characters come into the book, chapter after chapter, episode after episode. But you still live part of your time in Mexico City. In the book, there is also something which I haven't mentioned. It's Acapulco, right? I mean,
Yes.
you went to Acapulco so many times with your parents who were dancing twist. And Acapulco was it was a Saint-Tropez of the time, right?
It was fantastic, Acapulco. It was just amazing. It was a magical, magical place, perhaps one of the most beautiful bays in the world. But sadly, today it's been overtaken by drug traffickers. And then we've just had this devastating hurricane that hit it, this number 5 hurricane that hit it straight. It's a devastated place now, but then it was a magical place, an absolutely magical place.
But you still live in Mexico City today, most of the time. Has it changed a lot since the memoir?
Yeah, it's changed a lot. You know, there were many reasons I wanted to write this book, but one of that was to capture that Mexico. What happened in Mexico is that we had the North American Free Trade Agreement that came in 1991. And of course, what we were worried about, and I mentioned with this great writer, Julio Cortázar, who spent most of his life in Paris, but you know, he talks about the fear of the United States, the fear of capitalism.
He's an Argentinian writer, not American writer.
Right. He spent a lot of time in Mexico, but yeah, he spent most of his adult writing life in Paris. But we were very aware of him in Mexico. I mean, he was a very important writer in Mexico because his writing was so original and imaginative. But he was full of fear about the sort of influence of capitalism on artists. And so we were all afraid of that. So I think I discussed this feeling in the book, which came true. I mean, the minute we had the North American Free Trade Agreement, Mexico now, today, there's a lot of Mexico that feels like the United States. I mean, there's McDonald's, there's all these cliches, but they're there. And they were not there when I was growing up. You know, things were hard to get.
Now, since a few days, you have the first woman president of Mexico. Maybe you know her. Are you pleased with that?
It's too soon to tell. I mean, as an initial feeling, pleased, yes, but also concerned because this president hasn't been a very good president. He's a populist president who thinks the policies of Venezuela or Cuba are good. And so the question is, will she be her own woman or will he be ruling behind her? That's what we don't know what will happen because she's been his right-hand woman for, 15 years. So we hope that she will be her own woman, but we'll see. It remains to be seen.
One of your major activities besides poetry and writing memoirs and novels is you have been, for instance, president of International Pen Club, but also of the Mexico Pen Club. And your major fight was about human rights, and freedom of the press, freedom of writing. And all this, you're not anymore at the moment president of International Pen Club. But, this is a subject that is very much into discussion in many countries, right? The preservation of freedom of press and freedom in general.
Yes, definitely. And one thing I did, this book just goes up to age 27, but it has a few moments of flash forward. But one of the things that I did that at the end of my presidency, which lasted 6 years, was to create the Democracy of the Imagination Manifesto, because a lot of what is happening in the world today is telling writers and artists that you can only write from your own experience, you can only write from your group or work from that place, or else you get canceled and attacked. And there's a lot of fear. And so for me as president, I felt it was very important to defend the imagination and create a document that artists and writers could use to defend themselves. That PEN International, the largest and oldest writers organization, defends the right to use your imagination and be who you are not. One of the examples I always give is Baldwin, his description of a woman giving birth. It's the most beautiful thing I've ever read on that subject. And, he was even gay. So maybe he never even had an amorous relationship with a woman. But his description of a woman giving birth is amazing. So I worry about young writers feeling that they have to only write from their group and from their experience.
let's go back to The Promised Party, your book. We talked about Mexico, but at age 18 or 2018, maybe you moved to
New York,
United
18.
States. And that's because ultimately you will go to NYU, to university first. And what is interesting is that you meet this Canadian girl, Suzanne. And Suzanne, it's interesting, she had this desire to go to New York from Canada and one-way ticket, no coming back.
No coming back.
And you were very attracted by her and shared for a while an apartment. I mean, you lived with her. And you already wrote a book about her 10 years ago, right?
No, it's more. I wrote that book in 97 and it was published in 2000.
Yeah, in 2020 years ago, 24 years. What was the title of the book?
It's called Widow Basquiat.
So Widow Basquiat.
It's about her love affair with Jean-MichelBasquiat.
Yeah, because she meets Jean-MichelBasquiat, if I'm not wrong, on a bench on Washington Square Park.
Yeah.
They become lovers, and he goes and stay with her for 1 year. And you describe the relationship, even in this book, when Jean-Michel disappears, and then you go and find him, and all what happens, because in this time, you dedicate also a chapter to this. You meet Keith Haring, you meet Colette Lumière, you meet William Burroughs, and a character that is much less well known that comes in both books, which is René Ricard, this poet who was also an artist and who is the one who somehow endorsed Basquiat before he was well known, right?
Yeah, he wrote in Art Forum sort of the article that really helped Jean-Michel, which was called The Radiant Child. And he was discussing sort of the art at the time, but really gave Jean-Michel a very important place in the article. And that was sort of the boom that really set Jean-Michel off.
So this was an odd time, yours, right? You were in university, but you were a waitress in a famous place where people used to gather at the time. You were going to parties, you were going to Studio 54. I mean, you have a lot of nightlife.
Yes.
And including early mornings where during the long nightlife, you were going downtown to see the fishermen with your friend Suzanne.
Yeah.
Can you tell me a little bit about this and what New York was at the time? Coming from Mexico, you spoke English very well because you went to English school and your parents were American. But how was the impact? We talked about Mexico City of the 70s, right? 1970s. Right. Now we are in New York, 1980s.
Right.
You're not more a child or a young teenager. You're a young student, a young woman already.
I felt that just like Mexico, I lived a time that's gone because of the North American Free Trade Agreement, essentially, deeply. I also lived this moment in New York City that was exceptional. And again, just by chance, I met Keith Haring very soon when I got to New York. And so my first readings of poetry were at his readings that he organized on Wednesday nights at Club 57. So that was sort of 78, 79. And then 1980, I go to Paris for almost 8 months or something. Then I come back and I meet Suzanne because we're both waitresses. And through her, I then meet Basquiat and Burroughs and all of this. And then I feel, and it's expressed clearly in the book, is that all that time also ended. It also had its end. And for me, the end was AIDS. There was this great moment of freedom and acceptance of everyone, and anybody who was different was embraced, and suddenly came AIDS and that kind of feeling in the city, which was also a very dangerous city too. People forget how dangerous New York was then. I had several friends who were actually stabbed and things like this. So I also feel like that time ended in a kind of dramatic way with AIDS and was never exactly the same again. So that's why I even quote that first article in the New York Times when nobody understood what was happening. And then we understood how dangerous.
How could you write poetry, see all these people, have endless nights, and be a student? Were you a good student?
Well, yeah, I did 2 degrees. I did anthropology and English literature. So in
When
3
did you find time for that?
I don't know. I mean, when you're young, you can do everything. That's why I said in some chapter there that I just did all this. I don't know how I did it. And I worked with Dr. Roberto Carniero, who was an eminence in cultural anthropology. I was an intern with him, and that was an extremely special relationship. And I learned a lot from him because he was a very rigorous scientist. Youth, I guess, Alain, I mean, you know.
But it is interesting that at a certain moment, after 1 year, something like that, Suzanne and Jean-Michel, they sort of split, right? They are not anymore together. And Suzanne, you describe it well, tries to overcome this sadness, her sadness, by painting herself. She decides to paint, but she doesn't want to make it public. There is a nice description when you're going to buy the colors, and there is Julian Schnabel who comes in, and you sneak out.
We hide. She didn't want him to know she was painting.
No, he doesn't want you to know he was painting. But what is funny is that you described the floor in the apartment, which had Basquiat remains, whatever, color, and then she covers it with her own color, and then there are sheets of paper who fly away that were Basquiat's papers. At the end, you have a fridge that is painted by Basquiat, and obviously becomes an object of cult because Andy Warhol buys it for $5,000 at the time. Is it true?
That's right. Yes. Yeah.
But how do you remember all these people, all these years? Did you understand how important they would have become or not?
No, people ask me this a lot, and I just say everybody was nobody except for really Andy Warhol was the famous person. And we all remember when Jean-MichelBasquiat in 1985 was on the cover of the New York Times Magazine, and we all had this feeling of, oh my goodness, he has left us in some way. And then the same with Madonna. I remember hearing Like a Virgin playing at the supermarket, and we were all like, oh my goodness, what's happened to Madonna? So there was this feeling that things were starting to happen to some people. But basically, I say it in the book, Suzanne and I threw away Basquiat's into the garbage. Imagine. I mean, that's how much we didn't think he was important,
And what about Susan? Her paintings became something, or she didn't actually?
Well, it's curious. It was all sold out. I have the Joan Burrows portrait, which I brought back to Mexico. There's a lot of, in the book, sort of stitching like a tapestry between the two cities. So the painting that's painted of Joan Burrows is brought to Mexico, where Joan Burrows is actually buried in a cemetery in Mexico City. What we understand, and Suzanne would have to get to the bottom of this, that all her paintings are in Japan in a collection of a very large collection of Keith Haring's work. But we don't know this for sure.
Suzanne is the one who calls you and tells you that Jean-Michel died.
Yeah.
And she says you have been so close. I mean, she endorses your friendship.
Mm-hmm.
And then you didn't want to go to his funeral or to his tomb.
Yeah, we've never visited his tomb. But we did that little thing of seeing the tomb on the internet. I mean, it's so extraordinary that there's a site where you can visit gravestones on the internet. It's like a delirious, crazy thing that we did one day.
And then there is Burroughs, the other giant. I mean, these two people were very well known, one as a writer, the other one as an artist, but they were both heroin addicts. And what is very sad in your book, you say it in a very discreet way, but Jean-Michel was aware of that, and he was aware of the fact that he couldn't stop.
Yeah.
He probably wanted to stop, but he couldn't do it.
And I think that Andy Warhol couldn't stand his drug use and was always, always saying, Jean-Michel, you have to stop. You have to stop. This is crazy. And I think a lot of his friends would agree with me that he kind of contained himself for Andy in a way, because it was this thing that they talked about and Andy was very disappointed in. But then Andy had this unexpected death that was a shock to everybody. And Jean-Michel died a year later. And we all noticed that after the death of Andy Warhol, he just had no brake on anymore. He just let himself go and was using tons of drugs.
What about Burroughs? Burroughs, who had to do with Mexico also.
Yeah.
He killed his wife inadvertently when he was drunk in Mexico City. And we said before he went to jail with the man who killed Trotsky. But you were obsessed by Burroughs. I mean, you were reading everything.
Yeah, I think we were obsessed with him really because Jean-MichelBasquiat was obsessed with him. And so we were, sort of included in what was there that was so fascinating. And what we really liked in his writing was what he would write about having wishes. What did you wish for in life and the dangers of what you wish for? So we were sort of like obsessed with that idea about what one wishes for. And also we were so young, we were 20 years old. So, we were full of wishes, at that age. Maybe we never get over being full of wishes. I hope not. But I remember, you're full of wishes. And that was sort of interesting to read about what you can or should not wish for. And also because the book is a tapestry, I was also finding the things that tied, even though it's like a tale of two cities, Mexico City, New York City, I'm also constantly in the book just sort of knitting the two cities together and how they cross and communicate with one another. And of course, the Burroughs story is a big story in my life. And I have the portrait of Joan Burroughs that Suzanne painted in my house in Mexico City. And that's why I got the permission to actually quote Burroughs in the book, because it's so powerful what he says about killing Joan and how he goes out to sharpen the knife with the knife sharpener in Mexico City. And suddenly he's in floods and floods of tears because it's a death foretold. He doesn't know until after he kills her that he was already mourning her, that he knew it was coming.
Can you just say in a word or two why he killed Joan? I mean, something happened. It was an accident somehow.
Well, he said this tremendous line, because it's recorded at the police station. He said, "The gun shot low," which is a tremendous thing to say. Yeah. And I mean, in Mexico, the photographs of her in the morgue are very famous. They were all published, and you can see them to this day. And there she is, like a beautiful marble figure with her lipstick intact and, a hole in her forehead. It's quite tremendous.
He was in jail for a short time.
Very short time. That's the other thing. Somehow or others, he got out of jail and everything, she was buried and everything was sort of disappeared. That was the Mexico of that time, a bit like the Wild West.
You spent time with René Ricard?
Yes, a lot of time. And in fact, I was at his funeral when he died.
That's what you say, yes.
Yeah. He was such an amazing man, so I had to sort of, in my little way, kind of honor his presence, because that whole world without him would have had a huge hole. He was just such an extraordinary person. And of course, he read at the Poetry Project. I read at the Poetry Project. My first poems were published there. His first poems were published there. So we were on the same roads in a way.
You finish your book when you're 27, 28. Why did you stop? Because after your life was less interesting, or because you wanted just to describe the beginning of your life? Or
I think because I wanted to describe these two moments of these two cities, to get into my children, my marriages, my books, my advocacy, being president of Penn. I mean, I don't know that I would ever do that, but it's like such a completely different kind of story that would have to be told. So I decided to end it at 27, which is symbolic, which is obviously that famous age when many people die. and not go into that whole thing. I mean, I have a mention because it's important. There are a few moments in the book where I go into the future. One is my big fight with Mario Vargas Llosa, which I definitely wanted to have there because, growing up, he was such a huge figure. And how would I have known that many years later we'd have this great big public fight? I have a great big book that I'll see if I can get to you also, The History of Pen. It's a big coffee table book. At Frankfurt, it won the prize of the best book of the year a few years ago. And it was written with 6 writers, including myself, all the history of pen. So a lot of the work that I did is in that book, for example. I mean, I don't know that I have a perfect answer to your question, but maybe it's more a poetic kind of feeling that was where, in a way, the book, which is not written like a novel, it's in this fragmented form, but it also is a kind of odyssey. So it's being at home, leaving home, and then returning home. So I felt that that's where it ended, with the return to Mexico. Why do I return to Mexico? What does it mean to be in Mexico? We're closer to the dead than to the living here in Mexico. This very extraordinary anarchy that is acceptance that everything is lost, very Mexican. So there's these things that, and also the promise. And obviously, the title of the book in Spanish is very deep because fiesta is a very deep word in Mexico.
It's called Fiesta.
La Fiesta Prometida. And it's also an echo of the promised land. In many ways, life is like the party that never happens, so that you're always promised is coming in a way. And of course, the book is full of parties.
What I admired in the book is that there's no melancholy. You don't say all this with regret. You just tell things.
Oh,
that
thank
happen.
you. I love hearing that. I love
there is no feeling of nostalgia. It's like describing what happened, but there is no this nostalgia, how better it was before, how great New York was at the time, how exceptionally talented people gathered there. Now it's no more like that. There's nothing like that.
Oh, I'm so happy that you
what
see
is
that.
interesting, and this is the conclusion maybe of our interview, it could be that you are sorry that many of the Polaroids that you took at the time, with Jean-Michel, with all these people, are faded. You don't see the image anymore. And therefore, maybe this book, especially the New York second part of the book, it is a kind of replacement for these Polaroids, which would have been witnessing by themselves the period, but as they disappeared, they faded.
That's so beautiful. That is so beautiful. I agree. Yes, they are Polaroids. They are fragments. They are Polaroids.
You didn't want to lose the Polaroids. You wrote instead.
Yeah.
Are you writing a new book?
Yeah, it's a bit too soon to talk about it. It's sort of haunting me right now. It's too soon to talk about the new book. But yeah, I'm thinking of a new book. I had a huge, big anthology of poetry that just came out in Sweden last year. A big book of poems. That was very special. But yeah, there's something that's stirring. So
you were never tempted to write in Spanish?
Do you know that I have written some things in Spanish, and I do all the translation of the books. I work with the translator very closely. It's really a collaboration of the translation. Yeah.
You live most of the time in Mexico, right?
Yeah, I live in Mexico. Yeah.
And you consider yourself an American expat in Mexico, an American writer expat, which is very much in the American tradition of writers who have been all over, Italy, Paris, and other places, or you consider yourself Mexican?
So the expats would be my parents. They were the expats. And I feel like I'm a strange Mexican, basically, because I don't look right. So in Mexico, it takes everybody a while to say, oh, yeah, okay, she's Mexican, But back to what you mentioned about Gabriel Garcia Marquez. I mean, his son, Rodrigo, that went to my school. That's why I talk about how our destiny became English, because it was such a strict English education. So he just wrote a book on his parents. And he wrote it in English because he also went to the British school. So that really marked us within Mexico. And because there was no Ministry of Education at that time. So if you either went to the British school, the American school, the French school, the Swiss school, the German school, every place sort of had their school, the Israeli school. I mean, if you could afford it, you would be going to those schools, which you were not given any classes in Spanish. Now, of course, that's all changed. All these schools are now completely bilingual, but they weren't at that time.
And is it Mexico still a very dangerous country where to live?
Right now, Mexico is very dangerous country. There are parts that you can't really be in.
How do you live? Are you free?
Well, Mexico City is pretty safe. I mean, I wouldn't go to some of the states that border the United States, or I wouldn't drive through them, or I wouldn't hang out in them. Those border states are very dangerous. All the violence is there. But Mexico City is pretty safe, I would say.
Can I just ask something else?
Yeah.
I know you're not in charge of Penn any longer, but you had the 6 years where you were. Can you comment on what you saw looking back at those 6 years? Did things get better? Did things get worse? What was the whole milieu that you'd lived through in that 6 years?
It's a really good question. I would say that the greatest sort of change that happened in my presidency in the world was social media. And even we as Penn trying to address, issues of freedom of expression with this boom that was sort of unbelievable of the internet, of, Instagram, Twitter, Facebook. I mean, it was just a really big challenge because things would go viral in 1 second, often a lot of fake news. In fact, the big meeting that I had with all the centers in Ukraine in 2019, it was all about Russia and the propaganda from Russia in Ukraine and the lies that were being told. Some of my Jewish family is from Ukraine, so I went to Odessa searching for them. And now, you can't even go there. I mean, it's like this whole horrific war. So, yeah, I would say, that was probably, having to do documents and address the way information now was moving in the world was probably the biggest change. And then I was president when Kagoshi was killed in Turkey. I mean, that was one of the huge cases and horrific and complex cases. I am the only woman president, and this organization was founded in 1921. I'm the only woman who's been president. So I had to address that. And so I did a lot for women writers within the organization, doing the Women's Manifesto, which ended up being taken by UNESCO, and UN Women as the core of their gender work. And then what I mentioned earlier, the Imagination Manifesto, which I did with the chair of the Nobel Prize for Literature with Per Wostberg, because just this feeling that the imagination was under attack as well, and that we needed to address that. So it was a complex presidency. And I think the main answer is that, what has happened with social media. And that sort of happened under my watch, this change.
And I didn't ask you one thing about Mexico. How do you perceive this American way of doing? I mean, they closed the borders, they opened the borders, they reclosed the borders. What do you think about that?
I have a book actually called Gun Love. It's a novel. It's about the trafficking of guns to Mexico and Central America. All this violence that people are fleeing from to try and get to the United States, because mostly they're fleeing from violence, is all sustained by U.S. guns. More than 50% of the U.S. market goes to Mexico and Central America. So if those guns weren't crossing the border, 50% of all gun dealers in the United States would be out of business. But, nobody really talks about this. So it's a drug war, but it's a gun war too.
Alain Elkann interviews.